us because I'm not a fan of Mike, but he's not here. Very good. That was weird, guys, wasn't it? I thought it was weird. All right. And again, you might want to check out the workshop, the series, the demos. I've provided links for all of that, or go out to the slides and pull these links up. Again, just a real quick note: if you're setting up your SQL Server 22 environment, you can use Azure, GCP, AWS, VMware on-prem, or a private cloud. You can use a pre-configured SQL Server 22 installation on top of a Windows Server 22 installation right in the Azure Marketplace. That's what we recommend. You know, that if you've got an MSDN benefit or some free Azure cycles or even permissions to do this in your work Azure Cloud, non-production Azure Cloud, you can spin this up pretty easily and then shut it down when you're doing any type of after you're doing your experiments. So make sure that you shut down your lab VM when you're not using it and step through all the lab instructions, and you should be able to get it going. Just a real quick, we're not going to go through all of these, but we went through, you know, how SQL Server 22, oh, sorry about that, is really the next logical step in the evolution of products and revolution of features from 2016, 2017, and 2019, where with 2016, we've baked in query store and polybase and always encrypted and row-level security technology. And then with SQL Server 2017, the key thing there was he introduced Linux and containers, and then it obviously improved the database engine and support for machine learning and graphing. But we also did, you know, that support for non-Windows platforms. And then SQL Server 2019 data virtualization, be able to leverage the polybase connections to third-party storage and improving intelligence query processing and talking about accelerated database recovery and database classification. Uh, Data classification from two areas, right? There's a product called Microsoft Purview, which we will take a look at next month. But Purview is really a enterprise grade, beyond SQL Server data classification, data dictionary, data glossary, schema mapping type tool to not just SQL Server, but file-based data and third-party data sources. But inside of SQL Server 2019, you can do data classification. There's a data classification wizard, and it'll pick out columns that it sees that might be that might need classification, or classification frameworks you can go ahead and apply to your data. With SQL Server 22, we've improved on that, where we've kind of taken a look at, hey, we want to provide the full breadth of data services, right? From the edge all the way to the cloud. Edge being things that run on Internet of Things or IoT devices with a smaller SQL Server engine to collect IoT related data. And then again, supporting SQL on Linux containers and Kubernetes, and tying in the Azure integration with Azure Arc-enabled SQL servers or Azure Arc-enabled managed instances or SQL Server virtual machines, or an Azure SQL managed instance that's not Arc-enabled, and then an Azure SQL database. We're trying to include the full breadth of different products, then wrap those into familiar environment, familiar tools, and be flexible with what you are trying to do. So we'll talk today about SQL Server 22 and its Azure enablement without any loss of performance and security innovations. And we've got these hero capabilities, and we'll talk about three of them today. Two of them are on the slide here. We'll talk about having a business continuity scenarios with the link feature for managed instance, and then we'll talk about Azure Synapse Link, where you can have this nice repository of SQL-based data, but leveraging it for analytics and then exposing it to, if you wanted to, analytic tools like Power BI. Next month, we'll talk about Purview and Azure Active Directory authentication. And then we'll talk in the months coming, we'll talk about Ledger for SQL Server and built-in query intelligence. But we're trying to leverage Azure's services and capabilities and tie those in with SQL Server 22 as much as possible. Let me just build the slide out. I'm sorry, guys. And again, the whole workshop is geared toward, this is the core of the workshop, right? We're going to talk about cloud connections. We're going to talk about built-in query intelligence. We're going to talk about scalability, security, scalability, and availability, and data virtualization, and extending T-SQL. So if we want to, we're going to jump in here real quick to connecting SQL Server 22 to Azure. And we're going to we'll talk about the hybrid scenarios, but we'll also talk about managing disaster recovery with Azure SQL Managed Instance. And that's when you can have a database or databases that you have on your SQL Server 22 instance, but now we saw we're 2016 and 2019. I would imagine 2017 as well too. They seem to have skipped that. um, uh, but you can have these databases on your SQL Server 22, 2016, 2019 instances that get replicated to an Azure SQL Managed Instance. Oops, sorry, guys. And with that, you can um, know that you've got a backup in the cloud that you can also fail over to, or do a planned failover or a forced failover with minimal or no data loss. If you do a forced failover, there's going to be some data loss, and you acknowledge that when you do the failover step. And then leveraging these real-time analytics with Synapse Link, and then uh, tying in an Azure Arc enabled or Azure Arc extension onto your SQL Server 22 instance allows you to incorporate some cool things for your SQL Server 22 instance that you can view from the Azure portal. You can see the node in the Azure portal. You can see the databases in the Azure portal. You can leverage the best practices in the Azure portal. You can leverage pay as you go in the Azure portal. So it absolutely helps you out on your Azure journey to have the Azure Arc enablement. And then next month we'll talk about Purview, and we'll talk about the Azure Active Directory. And again, SQL Server's kind of always had some hybrid capabilities. I mean, you could argue that running SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine, absolutely, that's a hybrid capability. That's a SQL Server workload that usually could, or that traditionally is on-prem or in your private cloud. You can run that on an Azure virtual machine, or other cloud provider virtual machine. Azure SQL Managed Instance. That's a unique case, right? That's the core engine of SQL Server. That's the administrative surface of SQL Server, but without you having to interact with the um, uh, underlying operating system or underlying virtualization layer at all. It's just you interacting with the administrative surface of SQL Server and taking using the benefits of the engine with the benefits of the cloud platform as a service environment for things like uptime, updates, backups, things like that. And then the Azure SQL database. That's absolutely hybrid. That's a platform as a service, relational database management system where you as a DBA or developer just see you kind of can see the master database a little bit, but you can you're just interacting with the database itself. And then there's, we've been able to back up SQL Server to Azure storage for quite some time, to, backing up over a URL and then involving in replication different Azure SQL or Azure SQL, or excuse me, SQL Server on a virtual machine using replication, and then also involving SQL Server on a virtual machine on always on availability groups. Not to kind of to include what we're going to talk about today, right? And then for the cloud connections, let me just build this out. Sorry about that. And then for the cloud connected scenario for SQL Server 22, again, Azure SQL Server, we've added the capability to do data replication with planned or forced failover to the Azure SQL Managed Instance. And you can now do a copy only backup from Azure SQL Managed Instance, and then do that copy only backup and restore that onto SQL Server 22. And then the analytical capabilities with Azure Synapse Analytics, the strengthening authentication protocols with Azure Active Directory as an option for authentication onto your SQL Server 22 instance. Microsoft Purview and creating policies, access policies inside of Purview for you to, though, sorry about that, creating policies inside of Microsoft Purview that allow or disallow certain activities inside your Azure SQL database based on a policy that's been created inside of Purview. And you can do that the enterprise for users and groups, and then people can read or write or do whatever you need them to do for against those SQL servers. And then using things like Microsoft Defender for SQL, that you can take a look at vulnerability assessments and get real-time alerts. And then you can leverage Azure Arc Services, which will also pull you into using Azure Active Directory authentication, but it also can do Azure-based inventory and best practices assessment and pay-as-you-go billing for your Azure, for SQL Server 22 when you've got Azure Arc enabled services on top of that. Now for business continuity, through Azure SQL Managed Instances. So there was some challenges, right? Because there were some difficulties around setting up DR sites, right? There's setting up a DR site where you literally, if you're in a private cloud or a colo, you're setting up a colo in one state or one part of a geographic area, and setting up a disaster recovery colo somewhere else. That's a known problem, right? That's no use to explain that. But you can now use PaaS for managed disaster recovery, and it builds an always on availability group and sort of a built-in distributed availability group, right? It's hopping outside of the availability group to hit that node in a distributed availability group. And then you can use that for offline disaster recovery using backup and restore. If you needed to, you could do if you failed over to your managed instance, and then whatever had led to you having to do the failover is resolved or the problem is gone away, you can use the backup from. Yeah, no worries, no worries, no worries. As I was just looking at your question, thanks for saying that, Jason. So you can do a backup, a copy only backup on your Azure SQL Managed Instance, and then restore that down to a SQL Server 22 box, and then use that SQL Server 22 box to resume operations after your disaster or downtime has occurred. Hey guys, we're just doing. I just want to break everybody. We have David Kursand on the call now. David's my coworker and friend in Microsoft, and he also is working with me to deliver this content internally and to customers. So I just want to say hi to David. I just saw you pop in, not to embarrass you.
Hey guys, thank you. Okay.
Thank you much for joining.
Thank you.
Hey, we had I had my first heckler earlier in the call. Somebody, I won't say his name. I'll tell you privately, but because it's offensive to say his name, I think. But he was heckling me as the call started. He asked me a question and he said, "Do that with more enthusiasm." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" So I kind of spoke, took another bullet, and I said, "What do you mean more enthusiasm?" I'm doing my voice inflection and my normal cheer for the topic, and then I said his name, which was Mike Hawk. Get it? Mike Hawk. If you say it oddly, it sounds like something else. And he started saying, like, yelling that I was calling him that name. So I dragged the screen to share it and show everybody. Sorry guys, I don't mean to give everybody PTSD for reliving that, but it was wild. I had to delete him from the meeting. Okay, so sorry, I didn't mean to have you relive that by me retelling David that. So with the SQL Server distributed availability groups, right, you have a data center one, a data center two with a primary and a secondary for your availability group. And then for your data center two, you might have a second availability groups with your primary and secondary replicas, with you have your read write node and your read scale node. And then with your distributed availability groups, you're including availability group nodes as part of the DAG, the distributed availability groups, to continue that replication. So the replication is going from the primary to all of the nodes in both data centers, so you can get that cross topology replication going. The log changes are being sent from the primary in one data center on one availability group to the second primary in the second availability group, and then put out being replicated to its secondary. And then the link feature for managed instance, and I'll build out this slide. Oops, sorry guys. The link feature for the managed instance, again, for that top bullet in the gray up there where it says SQL Server 2016 migration, I think based on the update that's been put out literally within the past day or two, where SQL Server 2016 and 2019 now support the link feature for managed instance, I think they can be both used for DR and migration. But here's the schema for the distributed availability group with asynchronous replication. So you configure you have your SQL Server 22 box. You configure an availability group and a distributed availability group, and you have the primary that's doing the replication over the Azure network from the availability group 1, and it's pushing that data over the distributed availability group link, and it seeds the secondary database, the replica database, if you will. It's sending over log changes and then providing that read-only capability for availability group 2. Now you can do online on failover to your Azure SQL Managed Instance. You can do planned failover where it'll stop the writing to the database. It'll switch the mode for the MI from asynchronous replication to synchronous replication. It'll switch the DAG. The database replication in a DAG is async by default. It'll switch that database availability or distributed availability group. It'll change that to sync, and then it'll verify your LSNs match, and it'll remove the link to MI, right? There's been some sort of an issue, a performance issue, or some reason to do the failover, and it'll provide an option. You don't have to do that, but it'll provide an option. It'll clean up the distributed availability group in AG, and by clean up, it'll remove them if you want. And then forced failover is another option. It removes the MI link. It'll clean up the DAG and the SAG, or the DAG and the AG when that SQL Server is back up. If it went down for whatever reason. And then your SQL Managed Instance, after you've done a planned or forced failover, it'll become the read-write node, and then your applications are redirected to connect to the Azure SQL Management through the listener that was provided by the DAG. And then migrate your instance level objects. You might have things inside of SQL Server that might need to be migrated, so logins or jobs or certain code internals that might need to be migrated over. So also on the copy only backup, I mean, it was a problem. I'm sure we've all done it. We've tried to restore a backup that was taken on a SQL Server that was at a higher version than the version that we're trying to restore onto. And it'll give you this nice little error saying, hey, the version's incompatible with this SQL Server, which is running at a different version. And you get a compat error. With SQL Server 22 and Azure SQL Managed Instance, you can do a copy-only backup. You just build this slide out. You can do a copy-only backup from the Azure SQL Managed Instance, and then do that restoration onto, you might have a new version of SQL Server 22 that was rebuilt because of some disaster, but they're both database version 957. And our engine team is committing to keep these versions the same so you can keep this copy only backup and restore capability in place. You can't do copy only backup from Azure Managed Instance and then restore onto versions other than SQL Server 22. Allegedly, I say allegedly because we have a customer. I won't say them, but they are indicating that they have done a restore of from a copy only backup from managed instance onto SQL Server 2019, but they had to do some additional things, and I haven't seen it myself, but I've heard rumors that you can do SQL Server 2019. I would not rely on it if I was a betting fella. All right, let's take a look at the demo just super quick. One second. Show taskbar. So I want to show you two quick demos, and they're each about 4 or 5 minutes. So just take 2 seconds, and I'll narrate through them. So hit. There we go. So we got a connection to SQL Server and a connection to a managed instance. And these demos are recorded, so I don't have a problem. And Bob Ward did these recordings. Worldwide Importers database here, configured on the SQL Server 22 instance. It's going to replicate the database, then kick off the managed instance link. Check to see the requirements are okay. Saying, hey, we're going to select the database that we're going to replicate. Then he's going to do a connection into Azure. Sign into Azure, sign into the resource group, sign into the managed instance that you've got in place. Take a review the mirroring options that are available for, it's an availability group. So it uses mirroring technology in the background, and it's going to give you the name of the availability group and the distributed availability group. The little check to make sure all this works wizard is going to be in place. It'll give you the little wizard or the summary of options. And then notice an AG and a DAG or AG and a DAG are created. And Worldwide Importers is now showing up as synchronized with the two availability groups in place. And then now you have a Worldwide Importer database on the Azure Managed Instance. And then here we've done queries against the SQL Server and the Azure Managed Instance where the read-write capability is still on SQL Server 22. And then your Azure SQL Managed Instance, that read-write capability is not there. It's read-only capability against the database because it's a secondary node in your availability group, right? So it's read only. And then it's its compatibility level of 957 or version 957. And then here against the SQL Server 22 instance, we're going to create some schema, creating a table called vehicle stock items and vehicles. Let that run, and then add some data into this table. So we're going to add some data into the vehicles table. Execute this, created the tables, and execute this, created the data in the SQL Server 22 instance. Now we're going to go over to the SQL Server or Azure SQL Managed Instance, and we'll see that the updates are there, right? We're going to see that we've got this table in the managed instance that has been replicated. Again, it's asynchronous replication. There could be some lag, but it's in the Azure SQL Managed Instance based on the updates that we just did. Then now we can say, hey, we want to do a failover of a database. Again, we're going to say we want to do we have to do we check on our sign-in status in Azure. And here you can do plan manual failover or force failover. Notice what it says it's going to stop doing for the plan. Forced is kind of what it sounds like. You can optionally delete these availability groups. Again, in your scenario, maybe you've had a server issue and you have to completely rebuild. It'll give you a set of actions that it's going to take. And then you can go in and hit finish and it'll do the failover itself. The log sequence numbers, they'll sync up. And then you can go into the database properties for the managed instance and see that it's now read-write on this Azure SQL Managed Instance, and that the availability groups are now gone because we opted to remove them from the SQL, the Azure SQL database. Get to the end. Yes. All right, here's kind of the same, kind of a similar view of this. You've got a SQL Server and Azure SQL Managed Instance. It's a shorter demo, but it's a similar look, but it shows some different things. So I thought I would show. It's only 4 minutes, but again, SQL Server 22, Azure SQL Managed Instance, and a database called Worldwide Importers on SQL Server 22. Again, you're going to start replicate the database. It'll kick off the wizard. It'll do the server requirements, and then you'll hit the database that you want to start to replicate. Sign into Azure, pick your resource group, pick your managed instance that you want to replicate to. They'll tell you about collations not matching and all that kind of crap. Again, you'll get the mirroring window to talk about mirroring. The big difference with this demo, it shows a backup and restore. Hit next and then hit finish. It'll do this as part of the wizard. Hit close. Didn't give the log sequence number, right? Because it just fired up. So now worldwide importers is synchronized. We've got the two availability groups, the availability group and the distributed availability group, and a worldwide importers database on the Azure SQL Managed Instance. And then we'll go in, run these queries against the SQL Server is read write, against the Azure SQL Managed Instance it's read only for your database choices. Again, Azure SQL Managed Instance, read only because it's the secondary right now. We're going to do another schema creation, exact same example that we just looked at. Going to create some schema here, a vehicles table and a vehicle stock item table. Populate with some data. Again, Bob Ward is from Dallas, so he's all Texas sports he's a fan of, and all Texas cities you see in his demos. All right, a connection to SQL Managed Instance here. And then there's the updates that we just did on the SQL Server database where there's the changes replicated. So pretty much everything's the same in this demo up until we do the restore piece. So again, we're going to fail the database over. It's going to step us through similar, exact same as we'd looked at earlier. Sign into Azure. Next. Confirm the workload is stopped, right, for the planned manual failover. Again, you wouldn't have to do, you just say, I understand for the forced manual piece. Again, you get the options of deleting these availability groups. You're going to select those. You don't have to, but you can. Hit finish. And then we're going to do a restore, I believe. Okay. And then now the copy only, the read only workload is now changed to read write here on the Azure SQL Managed Instance. All right, so now here's where the demo gets a little bit different. Well, on the database side itself, we've done, in theory, a copy-only backup. And we're going to restore it onto the SQL Server 22. SQL Server 2019, let's say that. Worldwide importers. It was taken from Azure SQL Managed Instance. It's telling us that it's failed because it's incompatible with the version, and that's okay. Can't do it on SQL Server 2019. So now we'll restore it onto a SQL Server 22 instance. So now this restore will work. Hit restore. And it'll run because of the compatibility levels, and it'll restore as worldwide importers MI. So that's the restore from MI. All righty. See if there's any questions. All right. All right, now let's talk briefly about the Azure Synapse link for SQL Server, right? There's some challenges. There's ETL is expensive, and there's operational data stores and analytical data stores, and there's, this is just another method for you to get to that operational data and leverage it, expose it to analytical operations. There's a new change feed capability that really reduces the impact on your OLTP workloads, because you're going really from SQL Server, from a SQL Server database. It is transactional, but it's going to a file space in Azure Data Lake Storage, and then ultimately going into a SQL pool that can be leveraged by Azure Synapse Analytics. And it's near real time between SQL Server and Azure Synapse. And then you'll be leveraging data that's in a Synapse SQL pool, and that's what's being pulled for your analytics and your Power BI, not specifically the tables and the data on the SQL Server. And then you can use this. You can use Synapse for Spark and for SQL Server. So again, for the using Synapse link for SQL Server, we've got a demo on it here in a second. You have a Synapse workspace, which is the work environment for Synapse. You have a dedicated SQL pool, which is a relational storage object inside of a Synapse workspace that stores data relationally. There's a landing zone, which is storage space, Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage space, to move your data from your SQL Server 22 box onto this landing zone. What drives it, that replication, is a self-hosted integration runtime. Of course, you've got your SQL Server 22 database, and then you've got engine enhancements on the back end of SQL Server to allow for that change feed to occur, for that data to go over the Synapse link for SQL Server onto the landing zone, and make sure changes are replicated near real time. And it's similar for Azure SQL Database can do this as well. Here's a little bit of how it works. Let me just build out this slide. I'm sorry, guys. So here and then in the bullet 1, you create a Synapse workspace. Then you have a dedicated SQL Server or SQL Server. You have a dedicated SQL pool in your Synapse workspace. And then you create a link service for SQL Server. And then that's done in Synapse, where you're linking Synapse to your SQL Server. And that installs a self-hosted integration runtime that connects SQL Server 22 to the Synapse control plane. And then number 4, you create an Azure storage account called a landing zone that's created for a landing zone that creates really a link service for that landing zone, some storage for the landing zone to go to, for the data, for the SQL Server 22 data to go to. And then number 5, you create a link connection for the link service for SQL, and then choose the tables in the SQL Server 22 database, and then start the connection. Your self-hosted integration runtime execute stored procedures on your SQL Server, and then snapshots of these tables are captured and then submitted to the landing zone in the form of Parquet and schema files. And the ingestion service in the Synapse control plane takes the landing zone files and then creates tables in the Synapse SQL pools, and then data is also inserted into the pool tables based on these initial snapshots. And then step 6, any modifications to these tables are recorded to the transaction logs. And then your change feeds within the SQL Server logs are put into a queue. And then your internal tasks publish those changes to your landing zone in the form of CSV and manifest files. And then the ingestion service takes that landing zone file information and sends these modifications to these affected tables in your Azure SQL, or excuse me, your Azure Synapse SQL pool. And then, of course, you can create front-end customer-based analytical reports with Power BI. I provided a link in the chat for this Azure Synapse link, as well as the SQL Server Managed Instance link. Let's take a look at a demo. Oh, sorry, wrong slide deck. Oh, sorry guys. Live demonstrations. So we've got an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace here, and we've got a built-in SQL pool, but we're going to do some other things here. We've got a dedicated SQL endpoint that's built. That's what you connect to for Synapse, to connect your Synapse engine. Then on your at your SQL Server 22 box, you've got a worldwide importers table. You're going to insert some values into a vehicle stock items table. Insert these rows. These rows are inserted. It shows you the rows. I know that's not very exciting. And then here in the Synapse area, we're doing a linked service. So we've created a link service called SQL Server 22 link. And then also we've created a link to some storage, and we're calling that Synapse landing zone link, right? SQL Server, it needs to link to SQL Server, and it also needs to link to some storage because it's going to replicate data out of SQL Server 22 onto the storage account. And in the Synapse workspace, I'm going to look up some data here. We're going to look up worldwide importers. It's identified as a SQL database. We'll get into endorsements at some point, but it's really you saying that you want this data source to be certified. It tells you who are the points of contact for the database itself, and it'll tell you about the related SQL Server and the related schema of the SQL Server. And you can drill into the schema and see the different schema objects under there. See the different tables, get an overview of the database, tell you about some schema classifications that are in there, what person's name, email. You can look at the schema again through this area. All through a connection, right? It's coming over that link to SQL Server 22. This is what you're being told about the database on SQL Server 22, but through the Azure Synapse link for SQL Server. You can drill further into a table inside the database, inside of a table. It'll tell you, this is Purview pulling this information in. It's being pulled in over the Synapse link. It's being pulled through for SQL Server and the worldwide importers table. And it'll tell you about the table and column names. And, if there's a contact about this specific table, it'll tell you information about that. Again, there's the link connection to SQL Server 22, and there are the source tables, and then the target tables. This is where it's from and where it's going. It's going into a SQL Server 22 or SQL pool in Azure Synapse. That's the target. There's a landing zone and then a landing zone folder path, right? It's going to pull Parquet files and manifest files to replicate that data into the landing zone. You can monitor your connection. You can monitor the link connection. The link connection itself, you can open that up and look at that through the link connections, get information about the link. It'll tell you information about source schema and table names, and then it'll give you a status. Hey, it's replicating that across the SQL Server link into the Azure Data Lake storage, into the landing zone, and into the Azure SQL pool. So you can open up the SQL pool through the Azure Synapse workspace and then do a query against the Azure SQL pool. And that's what this is. You're connected to the pool and you can run a query against this, the data that's in the SQL pool, and it'll give you kind of a start time and run time. And then you can actually have these results as part of a chart very quickly if you wanted to, similar to like a Jupyter notebook or an Azure Data Studio, a notebook in Azure Data Studio. See the data points here, Amarillo. And then here, we're going to do some new insertions. We're going to do some new stock items for some different cities in Texas. So we're running this against the SQL Server 22 instance. And then now we're going to run a query against the SQL pool. We're going to see if we can get this data that's been replicated to the Azure Synapse, the Azure SQL pool, Synapse SQL pool. And we can see that it has been the additional cities. And then you can also see here that the values have changed inside of Power BI. And you can simply refresh your Power BI piece here. Running the refresh, you can see. Okay. All right. It's I think we'll just go ahead and stop here and we'll pick up the next session for Azure Arc enabled SQL Server because there are some demo sections in here to talk about, but I'll keep going. I'll keep going and we'll just stop in 5 minutes. With the Azure Arc enabled piece for SQL Server, you can leverage things like pay-as-you-go licensing. So as you consume SQL Server on an Azure VM or with the Arc-enabled SQL Server agent installed, you can consume it as you go. Free inventory of your instances and your databases from the Azure portal, right? You can see your Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server from the Azure portal. And you can also drill and see the databases on those SQL servers. You can manage it as almost an object inside of Azure. You can also run a best practices assessment against your SQL Server 22 machine. It doesn't have to be SQL Server running on an Azure VM. It can just have the Azure Arc enabled agent on it, and it can leverage Defender and best practice assessment. You can also bring in Azure Active Directory as an authentication mechanism, and then also Microsoft Purview. And we'll talk about Azure Active Directory and Purview next month. Let's do a real quick demo on this. Oops, sorry. Now this first demo is just showing you how it's quick. They're all like 30 seconds or a minute and a half. This is showing you the installation options, some things you can choose to do with how you're licensed for SQL Server, with standard or enterprise, for your SQL Server 22 installation, in addition to um, um, Azure extension for SQL Server. And set up your Azure extension for SQL Server as an installation option. Choose that. Make sure you have an Azure account. And then you select your tenant ID, subscription ID, resource group, Azure region. If you're doing a proxy server, you can, it's optional, you can choose that. And then your Azure region, and then you're good to go. So you can do this after the fact with some PowerShell scripts, I believe. But the best way to do it is to do it on your installation of SQL Server 22. Hold on one second. Also, it runs as a installed agent, right? You'll have an Azure machine or Azure connected machine agent the top here. And then you'll also have a Microsoft monitoring agent. And then you'll have the Microsoft SQL Server extension. So you'll notice these three pieces when you do an installation of the Azure Arc-enabled agent. And you can remove those as well. You can remove them after the fact if the performance issue, there shouldn't be any performance issue whatsoever. But if there's something your security team or compliance folks don't like, you can always go back. Then here is taking a look at the Arc-enabled SQL Server installation from your Azure portal. You see where you've set the licensing up, the edition. You can actually drill into your databases you have on your SQL Server through Azure, and you can look at the database information about the maintenance settings and set up best practices and leverage Microsoft Defender for the cloud, all from your Azure portal. You can also leverage things like Azure Resource Graph Explorer to get information about different things. In this example, you're trying to look at compatibility modes for different databases across your enterprise. So this is looking at SQL Server instances and the database compatibility levels across the enterprise, and it'll pull back that information as well. You can also run a best practices assessment against your Azure Arc enabled SQL Server 22 box, and you can, run an assessment, view assessment results, um, you know, annotate that a recommendation has been resolved, or see if there's additional insights, any new issues that might come up on your best practices assessment. For Azure SQL workloads, Azure Managed Instance workloads, SQL Server running on Azure VMs, or SQL servers with the Azure Arc enabled extension running on it. It tells you very clearly what it might see that you're doing, that you could get more aligned to best practices. Take a look at new or resolved issues. Maybe look at certain insights around some things that might see that might need to be checked. All right. All right, guys, I think we're going to stop here. But are there any questions about anything at all that we've talked about? No? Okay, hold on one second. Drag our Teams meeting here. All right. Again, the meeting's recorded. I'll have the recording up. I got to go do an errand real quick in this crappy rainy day. But I'll have the recording up about 3 o'clock, 3:30 on YouTube. I'll post that I've put it up on the Meetup site. Thank you all for attending. I'm glad that Mike did not return back. He was an odd call. And everybody go have a good weekend and check out SQL Server 22. Thank you all. Oh, I'll stop recording.
Thank you, Tim. It was a great
Okay,
session.
thanks. All right, thanks, David.